Hello, my name is Michael Goodson, and I am the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Contemporary Dayton. It is our great honor to, over the last few months, have presented Samuel Levi Jones, The Empire is Falling. I'm going to be introducing Sam tonight along with Camille Bacon in conversation. Before I do that, I'd like to just very, very briefly thank our sponsors for this exhibition, the Willitha McGuire family as our primary sponsor, the Vela Family Fund for Social Justice, that would be Chuck and Donna Vela, who have been longtime supporters of the Contemporary Dayton. Thank you, Chuck and Donna. Mitosis, who's actually running this live stream tonight, is our media partner, and they have been just a pleasure to work with. They make everything easy. Thank you so much for the folks at Mitosis. And Dr. Robert Brandt Jr., who is also a longtime supporter of the Contemporary Dayton and a supporter of this exhibition as well. Thank you to all of those sponsors. You have made this possible, and we are in your debt. I wanted to talk just very, very briefly about my experience with Sam's work, which is not the experience with Sam's work, I don't think, by any means, but basically, a few years ago, in of all places, at, I believe it was the Art Basel Fair in Miami Beach, which is arguably the worst place to look at art or to think about art in the world in moments, simply because of the cacophony of ideas. I was at the time planning a show by Tamashi Jackson, who, not in a way that's so very dissimilar from Sam's, takes these things that you might not think of as elements of a painting, combines them together in an effort to kind of collapse certain histories into a painting, into an abstract painting. At that art fair, while I was thinking about that show, I came across this incredible work that from a distance looked like just a beautiful work of abstraction. As I moved closer to it, both physically and ocularly, and then consciously, I realized that there was no paint in this work at all. It was actually medical books, the covers of medical books that had been deconstructed and then sewn back together. And I thought and thought and thought about that and why that must be. And there was a brief synopsis there as to Sam's ideas, but then in short order, maybe on that same trip, I came across this statistic, this obstetrics statistic about death rates among children born to women of color, and really death rates among women of color giving birth, as opposed to death rates in many other demographic groups. Those numbers were, for me, staggering. And I immediately went back to Sam's painting. And the rubric came completely into focus. I just thought it was one of the most brilliant things I had ever seen, this idea of presenting the vista of abstraction, and beautiful abstraction at that. And it was definitely a painting that took apart the histories of abstraction. I thought immediately of Sam Whitten and Al Loving and great expanded field painters like that. But it also took apart and collapsed other histories into this object, into this painting. I became very, very concerned with these compelling works from that point forward. And I knew then that I really wanted to work with Sam and do an exhibition. And here we are about 4 years later, and we are standing actually in the midst of Sam's exhibition here at the Contemporary Dayton. Before introducing Sam and Camille, I'd like to do something that may come off as a little odd, but just to give you a sense of the show and the space, I'm going to wheel this camera I'm in front of kind of around the gallery very briefly to give you a sense of the paintings. One thing I'll tell you is that what we did immediately was build a few walls. Basically, this wall back here that has a painting called Seek the Story of the Giraffe, which is a painting made of medical books. I built that wall so that it could be taken in immediately with this incredible painting, multi-paneled painting called Talk to Me, that is also constructed from medical books. The other thing that we did was build this wall to house a painting that became really, for me, one of the seminal works in the show. This painting is called Tamir. It is made of medical books that are exclusively from Cleveland, Ohio, which is the city that Tamir Rice was born, briefly lived, and was murdered by police. The inclusion of this work really did make every tumbler of the show fall into place for me. It was Sam's suggestion, and it really has become one of the most meaningful installations for me in what is now a 20-year career. I absolutely love this work. Let me wheel around a little bit just to give you a sense of the show, and then I'll introduce our guest tonight. This is Talk to Me, which is an epic work. This is Seek the Story of the Giraffe, a little closer, which is from an incredible collection in Chicago. It's really a beautiful painting. These three works are all works that are made from rendered and reconstructed medical books. This is a work made from reconstructed portfolios, as are these three works. I actually really love this work in the show. It's called Skewed, and it is made from, I'll look to make sure. This is also law books, and this is one of the works. When we opened it for the show, I was just sort of knocked out by it. I think it's so beautifully composed. Also in the show are a series of new works. That are kind of a new process for Sam. These works are works that are made by pulping the covers of books. One of the interesting relationships to painting that is exemplified in these works is that all the pigment in these works comes directly from the cloth and the binding of the books that have been pulped. And lastly, Sam made this work for the exhibition. This one also really knocked us out when it arrived. So this is actually kind of a combination of pulped books and sewn books. In any case, I think you get the idea of the space and the power of these works. Again, it's been our great pleasure to install them, to care for them, to live with them, and to share them. This show, even during these very, very trying times, has been incredibly well attended. People are just very, very curious about this work. We did a national advertisement, we did local advertising, but basically all that served to do was draw people into what they knew in terms of ideation and formal concerns, what is essentially some of the best work being made in our moment, in my estimation. With that, I'll introduce our guest. Is the San Francisco Museum of Art and the Madison, Wisconsin Museum of Art, the Rubell Collection in Florida, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Whitney Museum of Art, Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. In 2014, Jones was the recipient of the Joyce Alexander Wine Prize, which is the annual prize given by the Studio Museum in Harlem. And he is the recipient, which basically has many prominent recipients, including Leslie Hewitt, Glenn Ligon, Lorna Simpson. He is in that pantheon of incredible artists in this regard. Jones was born in Marion, Indiana in 1978, and now lives and works between Chicago, Illinois, and Indianapolis, Indiana. Camille Bacon is a Chicago-based artist, Chicago-based writer and art critic, but I would assume also an artist in her own right, and is making work now, making ideas now that are inspired by, among other things, by Nikki Finney and the legacy of Tony Cade Baramba. Basically, she is in the vast lineage of Black female writers more broadly. I have read in recent weeks, Camille, many of your writings. I just really love the clarity of them. And they feel like writing for people who truly want to connect with these ideas, as opposed to writing for art theorists, which certainly has its place, but I found your writing incredibly refreshing. I'm so very proud to have both of you here. And now let me please welcome Samuel Levi Jones and Camille Bacon.
Hello, Sam. Congratulations on your beautiful exhibition. I'm wondering if we can just hit the ground running and talk a little bit about why you said yes to Michael's proposal, and sort of thinking specifically about the geography of Dayton, the similarities it might have with Marion, Indiana, and the other spaces that you have lived across your life.
Yeah, I think, to speak on the geography and location, it was really interesting and ironic because we've talked about this before, and it just so happens that Dave Chappelle lives in the area, and there's one thing that he said about moving back to the area, and he said that geography was the greatest life hack. In relationship to where I grew up in Marion, it's a small town, and thinking about that place in which I come from, and it's a working class town, and there wasn't a whole lot of experience to the arts or experience, or there wasn't a whole lot of sort of I'm at a loss of words, interaction with the arts. There just wasn't it wasn't available, if you will, and it wasn't until much later that I became interested through exposure. So that was the word I was looking for, exposure. And I think about that a lot, and I think about showing the work and engaging in spaces and locations to where there is sort of very little exposure, and providing that or offering that and having that exchange.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can talk also about the title, The empire is falling. And we spoke a little bit about this earlier today, but thinking about the kind of intention behind using the word falling as opposed to fallen or will fall. So I wonder if you can speak to the particular wording, and then after that we can go a little bit more conceptual and think about what it means to make such a statement.
Yeah, I think in some ways, initially, it seems like a very sort of strong two words. It seems, think of destruction, or may even feel a little bit violent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as such. And the idea of it falling is sort of just like this unraveling or coming apart, and sort of a change from which, the way in which this empire or a structure exists. And, when you and I spoke earlier, it doesn't have to be such a dramatic thing, but sort of a thing of change. And, how do we embrace it instead of being fearful of it?
As you know, I have been reading Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, and she opens the book with this kind of parable, I guess, but really a list of affirmations. So it goes, everything you touch, you change. Everything you touch changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And of course, that's kind of top of my mind because that's what I'm reading right now. But also thinking about, as you've mentioned, the kind of like melodrama that might be assumed by a statement such as the empire is falling. But in reality, it's not necessarily a threatening thing. It's merely kind of almost like a proposal for change, as you're saying, and like maybe not change in the scale or the grandeur that we might be used to thinking about social change and political change in particular. But I wonder if we can use that as a bridge to start talking about the deconstruction of the book. So thinking about legal texts, medical texts, art books, encyclopedias, all of these bastions of knowledge. And then what it means that, as Michael mentioned earlier, and as you have spoken extensively about, not only are entire populations left out of those books, particularly Black people, but also those very exclusions have been used to pathologize Black communities and to criminalize Black communities. And I wonder kind of where that link is if you are basically gutting these books of their capacity to continue harming people, and what that kind of has to do with the empire falling. So really, I'm asking you about education, I suppose. I'm asking you about what it means to take materials out of circulation that are ultimately predicated on Black death and Black dying, and have been instrumental in building and upholding systems that allow for that dying to continue to happen.
Yeah, in terms of, these books that are being broken down and being deconstructed, it's, they're in, for a long period of time, they were looked at as sort of truth, if you will. And what does it mean to disrupt them? And even thinking about, the source material, the reference material as an empire in of itself, and coming to a place to where it's, you're in disagreement with it, if you will, and sort of like challenging that narrative, and trying to bring in the narratives, like you said, that have been left out of history. And it's really interesting because some people are bothered by the disruption of these books and sort of deconstructs. Not a lot, but on occasion, some people have asked me about that and sort of what that means, and they sort of feel uncomfortable about it. But I think change is uncomfortable, and also too, and going back on what you're talking about a second ago about this idea that it doesn't have to be a negative thing, if you will, but there are those who have the position of power that exist within a structure that's built around them, and I can very much so understand like the fear that what that may look like, or how they may come out on the other side of that.
And with that in mind, I wonder if you can speak, if any particular experiences come to mind of people being bothered by your use of the books, and particularly your destruction or desecration of the books. Like, what kind of statements were being used, what were they particularly bothered by, because it reminds me of people calling Colin Kaepernick unpatriotic for kneeling. Like, that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I know that's something you think about too.
Well, there's one, you know, each individual has their way of seeing things. And, you know, you know, a certain individual, you know, one thing may feel harmful or negative to you or myself, or may not feel the same way towards someone else. And it's a tricky thing, because in that position, that situation, you just sort of, you automatically go on the stance of defense rather than being open to, you know, the idea of engaging in something that's different than what you're thinking about, and possibly being open to, you know, being wrong. There, you know, I can imagine there's things that I think that may not be entirely right or problematic, and, you know, but what does it look like for myself to acknowledge that and have that vulnerability to not go on the defense and to have a conversation around that. And it's, you know, it is a difficult thing.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about something that we have spoken extensively about in other conversations, but thinking about the value of naming things explicitly and thinking about how that relates to our capacity to admit when we're wrong, or really, more importantly, to admit when we've done harm, and to understand that, you know, the way that harm is maybe intertwined with the very systems that your work is interested in dismantling, or at least holding into the light. And I think that there's often this hesitation around infusing artworks, especially abstract artworks or artworks that fall potentially in a tradition of minimalism, and regarding those artworks as entities that are also infused with personal histories and also infused with political questions and social questions. And I would imagine that particular characters who have taken issue with your use of the books might like kind of use that as a bit of a spear, and kind of use that as a way to, I don't know, almost to devalue the work that you're doing. Like, there's this kind of association between abstraction and apoliticism. And I wonder the value that your work has, particularly in interrupting that cycle, and particularly in helping people think about how the ideas that they might believe are commonplace, commonly held, completely innocuous, are actually the complete opposite. And how, when we learn to name the ways that systems creep their ways into our everyday interactions with one another, that then becomes the place where this really terrifying, uncomfortable change can maybe be something we can actually sit with and work through with one another.
Yeah, you know, the work in this, you know, the work in relationship to, you know, the aesthetic of it and working with it, it's you know, abstraction. You know, I remember having an exhibition one time, and I was talking to a gentleman who was looking at my work, actually in London, and as I was explaining it to him, you know, sort of what the nature of the work was about in relationship to the material and the subject matter for which I'm addressing, he just sort of sat there and he said several times, he was like, I don't get it. Like, I don't see that in the work. But for him, like, visually, for some reason, he had to literally see it. Even at explaining, you know, whether I'm using encyclopedia in terms of like thinking about histories and narratives, or using law books and how it's beneficial to, you know, certain people and not so beneficial to other people. You didn't understand, but, you know, not everyone's going to get it. But it's sort of it's really interesting in the way I which and how I came to working with this material. And it's I don't know, and for those who don't know and may not have heard, I'll briefly go over that. There's a work that I made called 48 Portraits, and it was a reactionary to a work. It's called 48 Portraits Underexposed, and they are images of 24 Black men and 24 Black women who could have been imaged in the 1972 encyclopedia that weren't. And it's a response work to Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits of white men, and his source images were from the encyclopedia. And the strange thing about it was, I sought out to get a set of encyclopedia, and so the work that he showed was shown for the first time in Venice in 1972, and it just so happened that the set of encyclopedia that I got to examine were also from 1972, just by chance. And so I always look back on that and just sort of it just seemed like it made sense, and that like it was meant to be. So I never really questioned sort of the journey that I'm going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I wonder, on the note of the actual craft of making the work, if you could also talk a little bit about the transition from deconstructing the books, and maybe even a little bit about what that process actually looks like and what that entails, and then into pulping the books. So for those of us who were here when Michael was doing his dolly shot of the show, there is an entire gallery with 3 of the pulped works, and they're kind of separated from the other ones. So yeah, tell us about literally how you make these objects.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm sitting in the studio and I'm like almost tempted to grab a book and tear it apart. But I use a knife and I cut where the pages connect to. I'm like staring at books. The pages connect to the covers of the books, and I cut them out, tear them out, and I take the cover and soak them. I'm gonna do it. I'm just like, sometimes I have a hard time.
Yeah, you can show us.
Yeah, so here is this is a law book, and sometimes I'll do like a small incision at the edge. I'll cut it away, and I don't know, and I'll just pull it out, and then I end up with this. And then I soak these in water. I soak these in a tub of water to loosen the adhesive from the cover. And then I end up with, this is what it looks like after I've
So is that
okay,
got it.
I just so happened to pull up an Ohio law book off the floor. That was completely random. And then I compose them on the floor and pin them together with T-pins and sew them together. And so for the process that I've been working on now, you ask about the pulping. It's really interesting. In the last conversation that you and I had, we talked a lot about the use of water and sort of the power of water. But I use a lot of water, and I use the water in this machine. It's a beater, and it's used to pulp the book covers. And then I strain the water out, and I use this medium it binds the material, and it also helps with the color, because if it dries without it, it's sort of a very dull looking color. But it took a moment to get to that. Yeah, and then I'm playing around with either, this piece here is just made of pulp only, and then there's a combination of using the raw, which I call skins. In the book covers, I refer to them as skins sometimes, and a combination of the two.
So when did the transition from exclusively deconstructing the books as you demonstrated into then putting them in the pulper happen? And I wonder if you can also talk about the machine you used to pulp for the first time, and like how that process has also evolved over time.
Well, the very first piece that I made was probably in 2015, and I used a food blender to pulp the material. And when I made the first set of, so I have actually 2 sets of the 48 portraits, and the original set that I made, that paper was recycled, I'm backing up a little bit. And that was the first time that I made pulp, and I pulped pages from the encyclopedia to use as I made sheets of paper to print my portraits on. And I pulped all of that paper with a food blender. It was a lot of work. But it wasn't until about had an exhibition in Chicago in 2019 at the Smart Museum. It was a group exhibition that was traveling. It was actually Pamela Joyner's collection that was traveling. And I made some much larger works, and at that point was when I got a beater, and it was a much easier process. So it's just like, it's shaped, the tub of it is sort of like an oval shape, and there's this paddle wheel that's adjustable up and down, and you start it off high, and as the material breaks down, you lower it as it breaks down over time. And I don't know, the longer you run it, the finer the pulp becomes. And a lot of times I'll just, run it overnight. And that's it, part of the process.
Love it. And thank you for that demonstration. I was very curious about what that looks like.
But then the difference between sort of the way that I originally worked with it and sewing the material together versus like the pulping, when I made that first piece, I was sort of really stumped. I stopped and was thinking about it too much. But in that moment, I hadn't, worked in the way of painting before. And I'd said to myself, a very different way of working. I sort of just decided that I was going to have fun with it, if you will, and just go at it. It was sort of liberating. It's liberating to sort of, we talk about change and progress and sort of what that looks like, and not having fear of what that looks like, and just taking a leap of faith and embracing it, which is really wonderful.
And it also feels like improvisation and experimenting is so much a part of that too, which takes a degree of faith and a sense of safety in what you've done before, I think, which makes me very happy to see. And I also, so if I'm understanding correctly, you pulped the encyclopedias that you got from 1972 as a means of making paper to make 48 portraits underexposed. So then how does the loop back happen, where you're then making works out of the books that are not portraits, but are purely abstract compositions? Like, when did that happen and why?
I never am afraid to say that, when I sort of like ideas like aren't always necessarily my own. I wasn't aware of the 48 portraits by Richter until a friend of mine, who's actually my studio manager now, mentioned them to me. She told me to look at them, and then immediately I knew what I needed to do. And then so I was actually in Sonoma in 2015 doing a artist residency at Pamela Joyner's, and my family was with me, and my partner and I were talking, and she goes, because we were talking about pulp, and she says, "You should try pulping the covers." I was like, "Oh, why not?" And so it was her idea, and she's come up with a number of different ideas and suggestions as to how I, in relationship to the process of my work, and it's fun. So I don't take all the credit. And it's a part of just like engaging. And I once had a conversation with a couple of artists, and I was talking to 2 artists at one time, and one of them said, I use a standard sort of sewing machine, and the person suggested using a larger sort of industrial sewing machine, and the other artist said, "You can't tell him how to make his work," and I wasn't offended whatsoever. It's like, take all the ideas and suggestions and play with it.
Absolutely. Thank you for walking us through that. I want to talk about abstraction again for a second. And I am personally fascinated by the ways that Black artists are kind of like the Black and the artist element of one subjectivity is conflated, such that I think audiences will often expect or assume that, first of all, if the artist is Black, they're going to make figurative work that is legibly about, quote, about Black people. And I think that, I mean, that's a phenomenon that we can observe, you know, since the dawn of Earth at this point. But I think that when an artist chooses to engage abstraction and also is still kind of at the same time deeply interested in these social political questions, it can stump a lot of people, and I think it can frustrate a lot of people. And I'm really interested in that tension. And as I'm going through kind of the list of works in the show, I'm noticing that the titles are often a way that you kind of bring the context back in this subliminal way. So if we think, for example, about the Ohio law book you picked up, many of which you used to make the composition called Tamir, which is named after Tamir Rice, that to me is the most glaring example of this happening in the show. And I wonder if you can speak to, first of all, how titles figure in your work, and if that is indeed a way that you will kind of like clue an audience into what you're thinking about as you're making it. And then I'll re-ask you the first question again after you answer that, because that was a long one.
Yeah, the titles are definitely a way to give the viewer a clue to discuss what the work is about. And I've always done that. And, you know, sometimes I'm, you know, a bit more direct than others about it. It just depends on how I'm feeling in that moment. But yeah, it's, you know, the titles are a very important part of the work, for sure.
Do you normally come to them after? Do you normally come to your titles after? Like, do you back away from the composition and kind of sit with it? Or does it happen while you're making, a bit of both?
It's a combination of both. Sometimes they'll happen after, sometimes they'll happen before, sometimes during. And, you know, it all depends.
Absolutely. Okay, back to the first part of the question. So I'm curious about how you think about the ways that your work is received or written about. So I always wonder if artists read reviews of their shows. I'm sure it's completely different for everyone, but I wonder if that has ever happened, if there has been that kind of conflation between your Blackness and your artistry and kind of the expectations that form in that space.
I mean, I don't think a whole lot about it in terms of the expectations. I do try to, you know, the work, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it more tonight, but, you know, in working with medical books, for me in working with medical books, there is sort of, you know, in the very beginning stages of working with the medical books, there were, you know, references to issues with, you know, medicine and the Black body. But as I went along, but even sometimes with the law books as well, and I, you know, was thinking more about the medical books and sort of thinking about, you know, I titled a piece 99.9, and that was in reference to the ways in which, you know, humans are 99.9% alike, and addressing things that you know affect everyone, no matter what you look like. And you know, and I do think about that a lot, sort of engaging a very broad audience, especially at this day and time, and what that looks like, and sort of, you know, it's really interesting how, you know, our current situation has been a very decisive situation, which was really sad. So, yeah, and even when you know, in the law books too, I can't remember the title of the piece, but I made a work that I titled after a young white lady who was gunned down by a police officer within a police precinct, and completely unavoidable situation, but it wasn't something that hit mainstream media. And I also, think about sexual violence that's imposed on women by law enforcement authorities, and how that's sort of not within mainstream media. And yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. It makes me think about something we spoke about last time, and thinking about how there is so much effort that goes into making Blackness and Black people in particular constantly visible. And specifically thinking about the ubiquity of footage, videos, images, even voice recordings of Black people being harmed by police officers in particular, and how on the inverse of that, there's so much of an effort made to kind of regulate the language we use to talk about systems of power. And that regulation specifically moves by abstracting systems of power and by kind of encouraging people to forget, encouraging people not to identify the spirals and loops that are happening across time. And I think that by engaging books that are not only the foundation of these systems, but are also so much a part of how they keep like recapitulating themselves, your work kind of helps us draw that line across time, if that makes sense. But this story about the white woman who was murdered by law enforcement officers just makes me think about that question of visibility and like whose pain and whose like the harm done onto one's body, when is that almost like profited off of the circulation, if that makes sense too. Like, I don't think media outlets would be interested in a white woman being murdered by the police because that isn't clickbait. And there's something really brutal and terrible about that. Like the many different ways that how people are valued is thrown back in our face over and over again in those moments. But I'm also curious, with that in mind, to think about something we spoke on the phone about earlier, which is a scholar named Kevin Quashie's book, which is called Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being. And he kind of interrupts the scholarly conversation around Afro-pessimism in particular, and thinking about how Blackness is often spoken about through the terms of social death. And he's like, okay, well, in the urge to make a work of art, in the urge to make a poem, in the urge to even do something as simple as like hug your mom or hug your kids or hug your friends, all of those things are testaments to our aliveness. And all of those things are inalienable testaments to our aliveness. And he considers this question of aliveness as our capacity to relate to one another. So he's interested in thinking about the ways that works of art that do kind of garner or hold this vibration of aliveness, how engagement with those works of art can be a means of shifting the terms through which we talk about Blackness, but also the terms through which we imagine Blackness and imagine the value of Black bodies. And he uses this phrasing of how it can increase our capacity for relation, or our capacity to relate with one another. And I wonder if you could talk about the kind of experience of showing 48 portraits underexposed in a public school, and maybe the kind of observations you made around how engaging with that work shifted the terms of conversation. And again, it's not a threat of change, it's a proposal that we all do it together.
Yeah, in what you're talking about too is I had an opportunity to show 48 portraits in a junior high school, and I was just sort of really blown away by the engagement of the students. And going back to the idea of like not having exposure, so being able to take the work and going to a location to where individuals most likely would not, or less likely to attend a gallery or a museum space, which can be, very intimidating. And, for me at one point in time, it was very intimidating for me to go into certain spaces. And and I really felt in that moment that, after the installation was up and sort of having the interaction with the students and, staff at the school, that it felt like that was where the work was meant to be. More so than, on a white wall in a gallery or a museum space. And, it was extremely moving. And I just sort of, I don't know, I think in that moment, it was a great opportunity to sort of, an inadvertent opportunity to really think about that and sort of think about the future of my work and the way in which I want it to exist and how I want it to be seen. And it sort of, yeah, there was something that happened too, like in terms of the engagement, and it felt sort of, the questions and the comments that came from, the young people it was remarkable. And it felt sort of, it felt, I can't really describe it in terms of how, and what it meant in terms of like the result of that in relationship to accolades that come from other things, other situations and locations. Yeah, it was amazing.
Is that a practice that you do often, kind of bringing your work? And when did that happen also? What year was that?
That was actually in like January of 2020.
Okay.
So it was right before, everything hit the fan, if you will. It was an exhibition that was only up for a week, and I was approached. There were a couple of art organizations that came together, and they had artists exhibit their works within, I think it was like four to 5 or 6 different schools within the city. And I think, gosh, in relationship to what we were talking about earlier, and I won't be so specific, but the context of locations where, hell, I'll do it anyway. There's, thinking about how arts are sort of implemented within the prison system through engagement, prisoners, making art and whatnot. Not to say that that's problematic, and thinking about schools and the lack of funding for schools and education, and the current situation right now is just sort of, the how it's so tricky in terms of like dealing with the pandemic, and whether students are in school or not in school. And I have a cousin who teaches, who told me that teachers are being pulled from the front office to substitute, and just doesn't, and she doesn't feel like there's support. There isn't, there isn't support. There isn't appreciation that's shown. And, I've seen situations where you just sort of, I think about that in relationship to, bringing arts and providing funding for the schools rather than pulling it, versus, going into a prison system. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but going into a system to where, like, what does it look like when you're, reaching youth at a young age versus, grown adults who are in a certain situation to have, less runway in front of them, if you will. A lot of ways where, things are very ass backwards.
In an ideal world, we would have no prisons and enough funding for all school children to engage with the arts. But I think that there is something, what did you say? This delay is freaking me out. No, just that it reminds me again of this question that Alexis Pauline Gumbs brings up of how we can learn from marine mammals and fish, and thinking about how fish all travel together as what we call a school, of course, but those schools teach them how to care for themselves by teaching them how to care for one another. So thinking about how particular schools of fish will swim in proximity to predators who are not their predators, but who also identify their predators as prey, if that makes sense. Like you're swimming next to something that's going to keep you safe from your predators because they're afraid of that thing. And other ways that fish have learned to adapt and have learned to care for each other and have then come to be called schools. And I think we have a lot to learn from them, as we've discussed, since we're reading her book, Undrowned, which I cannot recommend highly enough. But I want to talk about the context of this moment, of course, the resurgence of COVID, and use that as an opportunity to talk about your work with medical books. So if you could tell us a little bit about when you started working with them. And I'm also curious to hear about how something you mentioned earlier, thinking about sexual violence done onto women's bodies, but thinking about how that's also perpetuated by the medical system. And I think that has something to do with, excuse me, your introduction of those materials into your broader practice.
I started working with medical books, I want to say maybe it was either 2015 or 16. I had an opportunity, I think the first group of books that I got was maybe about 1,000 books. And it's difficult. It's easier to work with, encyclopedia law books because they come in, there's multiple books. And then with medical books, just, a book here and there, if you will. And, my interest in working with them too, my partner worked as a registered nurse for 12 years. And, we've, through that industry and sort of through time, we've, sort of thought about alternative medicines, if you will, which are really, I wouldn't say should be, viewed or called alternative medicines because whether it's, herbal medicine or whatnot, because medicine as we know it, in large part derived from those things. And, when you mentioned the book Undrowned, there was a part in that book too, or a number of parts where it talks about capitalism and the relationship and how societies are broken down. And there's this lack of, or of inability for people to sort of work together in the way that you described. And it's more about individuality. And, in terms of the medical book and the medical field and the way in which we know it, thinking about systems of authority and it's like who has that authority. And through our current situation, it's really interesting how in the beginning to now, like the narrative has changed because of what was presented isn't really turning out to be, what was promised. And, sort of like the dysfunctionality of that and the way in which has, become, quite divisive and politicized. And it's really sort of sad how we've, politicized like the human body and the health of it.
Have you made additional medical book works while we have been in this context of the pandemic?
I have, and I've, also made a combination of law books and medical books. I can't remember the titles, but there's, a definite sort of through titling those works, there is a connection to, the two of those things and how they exist together and how they control one another. And also control
Absolutely.
people.
Absolutely. I think that another thing that has been racking my brain is that HeLa cells have been used to engineer COVID vaccines. And HeLa cells, of course, were drawn from the body of Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman who had cervical cancer. And her cells formed the first immortal cell line, but they were extracted without her consent. So thinking about, of course, the endemic violence of that whole situation, but it's fascinating to me now that those very same cells are part of what is being used to make vaccines that are supposedly safe for all of us. So just to kind of bring that context into the present day, and just another reminder that the spirals are still spiraling, as your work reminds us of. But with that, I wonder if we can just pause for a moment and talk about Alexis Pauline Gumbs' book in a little bit more depth. So this book is called Undrowned, and it is by a scholar named Alexis Pauline Gumbs, as we've both mentioned. And she's thinking about how she can enter this thing that she calls marine mammal apprenticeship, which the first time I read that, I had major pause and was like, what is this book going to be about? But she's really thinking actively about how we as humans can learn from other mammals that also populate the earth. And she's specifically thinking about how the same discourses and tools have been used to regulate and surveil Black communities as they have been used to surveil, regulate, and also kill marine mammals. But she does this really interesting thing in the introduction where she basically lets the reader know that when she addresses you throughout the book, she could be addressing you, the reader. She could be addressing you, the marine mammal. She could be taking the perspective of the marine mammal. Like, she's completely playing around with perspective there. And that allows her to reintroduce, pretty much as you mentioned earlier today, like at the end of every chapter, she at least once says the phrase, "I love you," in the book. And you can never really tell if she's referring to the marine mammals or you, or if it's like this dolphin referring to you. And there's something really compelling to me about that. But when we spoke about it earlier, you mentioned how that's a phrase that you've been saying to friends and other people in your life. And I just would like to hear you talk about that to the folks who are on the call today.
Yeah, that was something that really, and that's been happening since before reading the book, and that really hit me because I think just sort of in the relationship too, and it was really interesting when you and I spoke when we did our last talk. And it was like at the very tail end of me being sick for 2 weeks. And something was really interesting happening in that moment. And I think, and this may rub some people the wrong way, but I think I try to, look at any situation, whether it's good or bad, and sort of find the positive in it. But somehow in that moment, the way in which I spoke and that we were having a conversation, it was like an extreme amount of like vulnerability that was just like unleashed. And but I think I also sort of like thinking about friends or family who've been sick or who've died within the last 2 years, and sort of really thinking about how do we come out on the other side of this, and also in thinking about my work and making work in such a way. And also, at one point in time, I donated the entire sale of our work to 3 different organizations who were, supporting different individuals or businesses through the struggle of the pandemic. And I'm sort of a very emotional person, and I don't know, I sort of organically, in a way, just like engaging with individuals or having certain conversations, I just sort of need to not so much simply say or express to someone that I love them, but really sort of pushing that energy. It's just like as a form of energy, if you will, and sincerely feeling it, and not sort of saying it to get a reaction. And sometimes, most times, in response, someone will tell me that they love me in response. And there was a moment where there was an individual who I think didn't respond with the same response, which was fine. But it's, there's, I think, through the difficulty of it all, there, and what may seem to be a negative thing, I think a lot of times too, in certain situations in people's plea to others to respond in a certain way or do certain things. It's, getting back to where we were and not really, thinking about the idea of like the falling, the empire is falling, or thinking about things falling and that we know as they are, and not necessarily seeing it as, maybe where we were before wasn't so much a good thing, and um, thinking about life and the way that we exist within it, and how could it look differently? Yeah, there was just sort of this moment of, and this realization of, not ignoring it. And the Camille, the night that you and I met when we were in Chicago at an opening, it was the first opening that I had been to, and through all this time, and it was very unsettling for me because it sort of felt like an energy of just sort of, individuals wanting to carry on as if things were the way they were when it wasn't the case. And I think, it made me think about too, we need to address these elephants that are in the room, if you will, and engage with them and have, meaningful conversations, meaningful interactions. And for me, that sort of is what my practice has always been about. And I'm appreciative of all those things, and sort of, what the work means, not sort of like what the object is about, not the object. And really sort of putting, sincerity, care, and love into it, into the work, and into the people in which I engage with.
That's the best possible way to end this conversation, because you just wrapped it up perfectly, answered my last question. And yeah, I think, absolutely wonderful place to end. I thank you for being in conversation, for making the work, but really for what you just said, for the care and love and consideration and sincerity that you bring to everything that you do. I think that this exhibition is just another testament to that. So thank you. And thank you to Michael and everyone at the Contemporary. And yeah, I think that's it for tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been fun. It's been great. It's been real. Thanks. And I love you.
Love you. All right. Good night.